Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Laura, and I'm excited about this episode that you're going to hear about trauma, leadership, and consciousness, why we must heal to lead. Kelly Campbell is a really inspiring human being to me. She has written an amazing book on heal to lead. And in our conversation, we explore leaders and how all leaders have gone through trauma in their lives. We talk about big T and little t trauma and the difference between that. But as long as we're a human being who grew up in some sort of home or family, we have had trauma of various sorts. Childhood is not easy, no matter how blessed we are with abundance and money and means, etc. Every family has certain types of dysfunction, and every school has certain types of dysfunction. Humans are imperfect, and we need to understand, deal with, and integrate our trauma throughout our lives. And trauma and healing trauma is a journey. It's not a destination. And if more leaders at all levels, including political leaders, can start to look within and work on their own trauma healing, we would have a better world, we would have better governments, we'd have better workplaces. So join me for this episode. We have an interesting discussion about Elon Musk as well. However, Elon Musk is just one example of leading from a place of ego and a low conscious leader who, still has done some amazing things. But imagine if he could be a conscious leader and rise above that ego, what more he could be doing for our world. So join me, and I hope that you find this episode as inspiring as I did. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Where Work Meets Life. Today's episode is on trauma, leadership, and consciousness, why we must heal to lead. And I am with an amazing human being, Kelly Campbell, who is a trauma-informed leadership coach, an author, a speaker, and founder of Consciousness Leaders. So I'm going to tell you a couple of things about Kelly, and then I'm going to let Kelly introduce herself. She's a former very successful CEO who sold her business in 2016 to move forward in her journey in becoming a trauma-informed leadership coach. And I'll get you to tell you a bit more about what that is. She works with leaders, both emerging and well-established leaders, who know they are meant for more in this world. So Kelly goes by they and she instigates change and impact in the world. So Kelly writes regularly for Forbes, Fast Company, and currently for Entrepreneur and on Substack. Her vision is for more than half of humanity to heal its childhood trauma so that we may reimagine and rebuild the world together. Welcome to the show, Kelly.
Laura, thank you so much for having me. I am really, really honored to be here.
Thank you. And I've been really drawn in my own career, 25 years in psychology, to how humans must evolve in consciousness. We need to create a better world of work and a better and more peaceful and loving world in general. I see so many leaders leading with ego versus the opposite, which is humility, authenticity, love, vulnerability. And your book resonated so closely with me, Kelly, in terms of how we as leaders need to be healing ourselves and our traumas to become better leaders and more evolved and conscious leaders. And that's, I think, one of the only ways that we can make the world of work better. So Kelly, tell us a little bit more about yourself.
So as you mentioned, I was a CEO for about 14 years, and I had a cause marketing agency. So we did a lot of digital marketing for nonprofits and foundations and social impact initiatives. And while that work was very fulfilling from the delivery standpoint and what we were helping to amplify in the world, the business itself didn't give me what I was looking for in terms of filling a void. I wouldn't have said it like that at that time, but in retrospect, after selling the firm, I really went on a deep personal journey of trying to understand who I was without a CEO title And it was really painful to realize that I didn't actually know who I was without that title. And so that really led me into some realms that I had kept at arm's length for a long time: spirituality and higher consciousness and healing work. Um, I think in retrospect, I realized that I had actually created that business at such a young age, really out of a trauma response, out of a way to prove to the world, prove to myself, and actually to prove to my mother more than anything, that I was inherently worthy and valuable and that I mattered. And I hadn't engaged with that idea prior to that. So, yeah, it was, quite often when we have these like awakening moments or circumstances that or conditions that create awakening, for me, it was the sale of that business because it brought me to the place of ego death. You mentioned ego and CEOs earlier. So, really, like a part of my ego dying in a way where I had no company, I had no title, I had no status. And so that's really what broke me down to have me engage with these more esoteric or etheric ideas. I I say etheric and esoteric because they're actually not. They're actually part of our true nature, getting back to our soul remembrance and why we're here and what we're here to contribute while we are on this earth. And for me, I was so engrossed in metrics and revenue and growing the company and all the things that we do as entrepreneurs and leaders of organizations, at least for profit organizations. I had really missed out on all of the other opportunities for experiencing deep, meaningful relationships with myself and other people. Uh, and also just experiencing the full range of human emotion. Like all of the trauma that I had experienced when I was a kid, because it went unresolved, I didn't have access to so much of the spectrum of emotion. And so that's really where I kind of leaned into making a lot of these correlations. And ultimately, after selling the agency, a couple of years after selling the agency, getting into consulting and then coaching, and now really focusing just on the trauma informed coaching for leaders.
What a fascinating and beautiful story. Thank you for sharing that, Kelly, and for birthing this book into the world. So, for those of you on YouTube, I'm holding up this beautifully colored book, Heal to Lead: Revolutionizing Leadership Through Trauma Healing. And I've read this book. I highly recommend this book. Kelly writes very powerful and very actionable book for leaders everywhere. And I think we should all be reading it no matter where we are on our leadership journey. So tell us what inspired you to write it, Kelly.
Well, first of all, I appreciate your kind words about it. I will say, before I talk about the inspiration of the book, that it was difficult to find a publisher that really understood that this was not a self-help book and didn't really belong in a category on a bookshelf with other self-help books. Because even though it has healing and trauma on the cover, literally in the title and subtitle, it's really an organizational leadership book. And that was the differentiation. So I was really thrilled when Wiley, said, yes, we also see it that way. And it's a point of differentiation in that leadership category. So I just wanted to mention that because a lot of people are like, what is this combination that I've not encountered before? Healing and trauma and leadership, what do they have to do with each other? And that really is the inspiration story for why this book. Through my own experience and making these correlations and seeing it in so many of my coaching clients, seeing it even as a consultant before I started, only focusing on coaching, there was so many people who were leading their organizations as a wounded child and not as a wise adult, right? You saw this in the way that their behavior kind of came out sideways, the way that their thought patterns had them ruminating, the way that they chose to lead. Sometimes their ego was so online that they didn't even see how they were communicating in really toxic ways, putting other people down and really leading from like a fear-based authoritarian, place. And on the spectrum, It's not the only way that that shows up. The spectrum of people pleasing and people controlling, the way I talk about it in the book, people pleasing as a leadership style is just as ineffective as people controlling and that authoritarian way, because people pleasers, and we've all encountered people pleasers if we are not one of them ourselves most of the time, people pleasers become unreliable, right? Because we take on so much and we're so worried about other people's workloads and how they're perceiving the organization or us as leaders, that we end up putting ourselves in situations where we take on maybe more than we should, and therefore a lot of balls get dropped. So we become unreliable. We also don't please for no reason. We're trying to also get our own unmet needs met from childhood, but now in adulthood in these leadership positions. And often we're doing that because we want something back, right? It's not for no reason. So when we don't get it back, when there's no appreciation, no acknowledgement, we become resentful. And then that can come out sideways, right? In passive aggressive behavior and things like that. So the impetus for writing this book was, wow, I think I've landed on something in this correlation between trauma, unresolved trauma, unintegrated trauma in particular, and leadership style, leadership efficacy. And why is no one talking about this? So between the work that I was doing and my firsthand experience and my training, I was like, okay, well, if that book doesn't exist, I think it's time to write it. So that was really the impetus for it, was to get that message out and be really, really vulnerable, as well throughout the book, because that models a hallmark of conscious leadership.
And you did a fantastic job at that. I felt like I got to know you as a girl growing up, as someone with an abusive mother. And then when your parents split up, how you were left with that abuse head on. And I really felt for you. And thank you for being so vulnerable, Kelly.
Yeah, I felt like you can't talk about conscious leadership or high conscious leadership, which really requires a tremendous amount of vulnerability. You can't talk about those things and then hold back your own experiences, right? So I had to get really comfortable in the discomfort of vulnerability and sharing some really personal stories and anecdotes about my childhood, about my leadership, and about things that I've encountered and discovered about myself.
And the more that I learn in my life, the more I learn everyone has had a difficult childhood in some way, shape, or form, because that's the nature of human beings and our situation as a human race. We are brought into an imperfect world and imperfect families, and whatever type of trauma it is, whether it is big T or little t, we all have stories. It's whether we are willing to share those stories or not. Can you tell us more about big T and little t?
Yeah, so in this sort of sector, in this field, there's a little bit of a bifurcation between big T trauma, which might be things that we associate with the ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. And those were all part of the Kaiser Permanente and CDC study from the late 1990s, which basically said these 10 or 12 circumstances, that people might encounter from 0 to 14, the hypothesis was that they might impact you as an adult. An interesting hypothesis, right? Of course they're going to impact you. But those things that were considered big T back in the late 1990s were things like if your parents got divorced, if you had someone in your household, particularly a caregiver who was incarcerated, if there was an illness or a death in the family, in the immediate family, if you were living in a war-torn nation, right? All of these things that we associate, physical trauma, sexual trauma, the big T, traumas that could happen to someone when they're younger. Small T traumas, even if none of those things had happened to you, I can guarantee that if ACEs doesn't resonate for you and you're like, oh no, I didn't have any of those big T traumas when I was growing up, so therefore I'm fine, I had a perfect childhood, I can guarantee that you didn't, because at some point during your first 14 or so years, you experienced small t trauma, which might have meant that you were left feeling abandoned, humiliated, betrayed, right? Some of these things that may in comparison to the quote unquote big T trauma may not seem like a big deal, but it's almost like death by a thousand paper cuts with the small t stuff. And so over time, whether these things are continuous, meaning that they are happening over and over and over again inside of your home or inside of whatever the unit is, the community is that you grew up in, or they happened along the way, maybe not as close as in terms of a cadence. Either way, they eroded your sense of self. And so in many ways, we can talk about this bifurcation of big and small, but what I don't want to be confused here is that one is more impactful than the other, because the small t traumas can actually be exactly the same in terms of impact than the big T traumas.
Right, exactly. And I just love the way you described that, Kelly. It makes so much sense to me. And when I think of my childhood, I had a mentally ill mother. And I would say that to some degree there was big T traumas and some of it was small t. It depended on what was going on because I had a very stable father to offset her. And when the times were good, they were good. It was just her volatility and unpredictability made it really uncertain and unsafe psychologically at times for me. And then at school, I remember being switched to a different school, and I was in fifth grade, and literally all the boys in the class called me donkey for a year. So I'm laughing now, but it was pretty trauma inducing, and that has made me into more of a people pleaser as a result. I have no doubt about it. I have no doubt that I put people's needs above my own, in terms of my business, in terms of my friendships. I'm always about pleasing other people and being overly flexible. Does that make sense, Kelly?
It absolutely makes sense, and thank you for sharing what you just did, because now I see why the content of this book resonated so deeply for you. There's a lot of similarity in what you're talking about. My mother also suffers from mental illness. It was not diagnosed when I was younger, and I had a fairly stable father when he was there, but he left at when I was 9, right? And so he was in the house, out of the house. They were trying to repair, trying to reconcile. It ultimately didn't work, but same thing. I had, some boy in middle school called me Dumbo because I had, nice elven ears. I think of them as beautiful and elven now, but at the time, that's what he chose to pick on. And so it does these little tiny things, and we can recall these so quickly because they're in our stored body memory, right? Yes, we might remember them in terms of mind memory, but they're also, the trauma is stored in the body. And I think that's something that, from the work of Bessel van der Kolk and Dr. Gabor Mate, that was really important to get into this book also, because I think a lot of people think, oh, this is just psychological. It's all in my head. I just have to stop thinking about it or stop ruminating about it. It's impossible to do that, because these traumas, these traumatic events, and how they've impacted us internally, they reside in our body. And I mean that in the way that that energy gets stored in little pockets of our physical body, right? Our fascia, our muscles, our tissues. People say the issues are in the tissues. That's what they mean by that. So, releasing that trauma and getting it out of your body is incredibly important, which is why somatic work, movement, right? Physical release of the trauma is extremely important in the integration process.
Okay, beautifully put. So, leaders, you talk about becoming controlling or becoming people pleasing, or it's a continuum, so somewhere along the way. And I'm doing a lot of research on toxic leaders lately, and I see more the controlling part of that dimension in the types of toxic leaders that I'm talking about. But I guess my question is, to what extent do leaders who have suffered trauma, which is all leaders, become controlling versus people pleasing? Like, what is more prevalent, I guess?
Well, I don't know that one is more prevalent than the other. if I were to assign kind of like a theory about it, I think in general, leaders who are non-male, let's say that, um, tend to be more on the people-pleasing end of the spectrum just because of the society that we live in, right? Women are taught to be more reserved, more polite, to be more pleasing in general, right? And men are taught to be strong and tough and, all of these kind of societal, cultural constructs that we live in, it's really hard to deprogram out of that. I mean, that's what healing essentially is. A part of healing is deprogramming all of that and creating new neural pathways so that you choose differently, right? And your actions, your innate actions start to become different than what you were taught. So as much, healing is as much unlearning as it is learning. But in terms of prevalence, yeah, I would say, and this is such a blanket statement, but male leaders, not all male leaders and some female leaders, but a lot of male leaders will tend toward the people controlling end of the spectrum. Female leaders or non-male leaders will tend toward the people pleasing end of the spectrum. There are lots and lots of exceptions to these rules, especially because of that sort of patriarchal construct that I'm talking about. A lot of women have learned that in order to be effective in the organization, that they need to take on some of these toxic masculine traits. So, there really isn't a huge prevalence because of that structural and societal construct. But I think that there's a little bit of, we can start to see some patterns, let's put it that way.
Interesting. I was just so curious about that. So I loved your concept of compassionate intelligence. Can you explain what that is and why that matters?
Sure. So, I think about the work of Daniel Goleman and, emotional intelligence and all of that. So if you think about empathy, empathy is feeling with someone else. Compassion is feeling with someone else and then taking some kind of action to support them. A lot of the feedback that we get is it's so hard to, take those actions to really support the people under our stewardship. Um, in a way that doesn't cross any boundaries or that feels like something that is reasonable within an organizational structure. And so compassionate intelligence is making sure that we are keeping ourselves in check, right? One of the examples that I use in the book is if you're a leader and one of your employees comes to you and says, "Hey, I'm having some trouble with addiction," right? As a leader, you're not going to dip into your child's college fund to put them through, an inpatient rehab program. What you are going to do is probably get with HR, refer them to HR, and make sure that they get the support within the construct of the organization. Maybe there's a paid leave. Maybe there's a treatment center that's part of the insurance program, whatever it might be. That's compassionate intelligence, right? I'm going to take action to get you the support that you need because I care about you, and it's going to be reasonable and within the boundaries of what I'm able to do, right? So just using that as an example, it's not over indexing to the point where we're now engaging our people pleasing so much that we're over giving and putting ourselves in a situation that might be compromising, right? So yes, I feel with you. I empathize with the situation that you're in, and I'm going to get you the support that I can within, a reasonable framework.
Yeah, I love that because I think we need more compassion in workplaces. I think through COVID, I saw more of that. I saw more compassionate behaviors, but I feel that that's been retracted a little bit since. And part of my mission was to really promote hybrid and remote work for the last 15 years. And then when COVID hit, that became a widespread topic. And then I've been pushing against pulling everyone back to offices. And I feel like pulling back human resources and pushing everyone back full time to an office in order to ensure they're working. I feel that's really moving backwards from that compassion of, well, what is your commute time, Kelly? What is your life situation in terms of maybe you have things that you need to balance in your work and life, and you could use a couple of days working remotely that would make a huge difference to your well-being. So I feel like that compassion, we have a long way to go still in a lot of organizations. Would you agree?
I agree completely. I do think that there was, we were sort of forced into becoming more compassionate in the workplace, right? Because everyone was sort of in the same boat with COVID. I think not only has that been retracted because money, right? We've got all of these offices and buildings that are sitting empty. No one wants to pay, for that empty space. And there's also this question mark of, okay, so now it's been 4 years. Are people working to the extent that they were prior to the pandemic? And now I have to micromanage a little bit more. There's all of these what ifs and all of these question marks in the minds of leaders. You also see, along the lines of compassion and humanity, you also see a lot of organizations wrongfully pulling back on their DEI initiatives. So while I do think this is all going to, be changed for the better, and we'll just leave it at that, there has been certainly a retraction. And maybe that's just part of the natural ebb and flow of like over indexing on something, right? And then retracting it. So there's sort of like this almost like an ebb and a flow or a pendulum where it's like swung so far to one side. Now it's swinging so far to the other side. And eventually we'll kind of hit this middle where there's more of a neutral stance, right? And it's a little bit more grounded. And we're, yes, engaging with people's humanity. We're being more flexible and more adaptable to what their needs are so that we ultimately are developing them, making sure that the organization is sustainable, bottom lines, et cetera. So we're getting there. I feel like we're in this transformative state right now where we've, again, that pendulum has swung really far to one side. Now we're in the swing of the polar opposite, and now we'll kind of even out going forward. That's how I think of it.
Yeah, I really believe that things are evolving quickly for many of us, and then some people are just hanging on to the control, the fear, and greed. I think greed is a huge one.
Well, but greed really is ego and power and not wanting to relinquish that, right? And wanting to hoard all of that because I better get mine before somebody else gets it or gets me. And that kind of thinking, especially in a leadership role, has no place. If it works for a very short period of time. Elon Musk is probably the best example of this. You see him essentially imploding at this point. He was extremely successful and is still, probably the wealthiest man in the world. But we're also starting to see him unravel because there was going to always be a finite amount of time by which all of that power and wealth and status um, was sustainable. Right? So we're starting to see all of these like patriarchal structures and authoritarianism crumbling before our eyes. It's a really interesting time to be in the work environment and doing some of the work that you and I are doing.
Absolutely. I wrote an article when he first took over Twitter, and it's about how he was pulling everyone back to the office, and the way that he laid off people I wrote about too, because it was so inhumane and it was just so toxic. And I said it's crumbling the culture of what was once Twitter. And I think what you're saying, Kelly, is exactly that. It's really degraded, and he has so much ego and arrogance, and it's really too bad because he has such a brilliant mind that could be used for so much more good in the world.
So I love talking about Elon Musk as like an example of a low conscious leader because he has all of these like kind of polarities, right? The reason why, I mean, he doesn't show up the way that he shows up for no reason. If you look back, and this is where we get into like epigenetics and some of the impacts of childhood trauma. If you look back at the way in which he grew up, right? His father and some of his schoolmates bullied him and berated him to the point where, as a really young kid, over a continuous number of years, he was in a position where he felt incredibly powerless, right? He's a young kid, he's being bullied, everything is being imposed on him. And when he was 8 years old, he said, one day I'm going to be the richest man in the world. And every single day since he said that, he has created a world in which that is exactly what he, is getting. But the ways that in which he shows up, and the reason why he wanted that was because of the power. He wanted to create a world in which no one could ever make him feel as powerless as he felt as a child. And so when you see him acting out in these really toxic behaviors and treating people inhumanely and not caring about their feelings, their livelihoods, their anything, right? He really doesn't care even about his own children. That all is in an effort to avoid feeling the powerlessness that he did as a child. So again, I have a lot of compassion for him. Um, I don't want any child to feel powerless to the point where they have to, impose that and project that pain when they're older. Now, if someone had gotten him the help to process all of that and really be a positive influence when he was younger, we would see a very different Elon Musk today.
Yeah, agreed. And speaking of processing that and dealing with our past little t or big T traumas, what call to action do you have to leaders in order to start doing that? Where do they even start, Kelly?
Yeah, that's the number one question, right? Because now if I start to recognize it, I have a little bit of self-awareness to say, huh, this is interesting. I've never thought about it from this perspective. How do I change it? Um, I will say that the healing journey looks very different for every single person, every single leader. I think the first part is that little sliver of self-awareness to say, huh, I wonder, that curiosity, right? To wonder, where could this be possible, or could this, make sense for me? Where might this be part of the story that I've maybe not looked at or avoided on purpose? And I think starting with talk therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy is a great place if they've never had that relationship before with the therapist. And as I said earlier, there's a somatic component that needs to also come online. So I think it's starting with talking with someone, starting to move the body as you're processing everything that has happened when you were younger, starting to make these correlations. In the book, I offer a supplemental resource called myhealingmenu.com. And really the reason for creating that as a separate website um, is to answer this question, because it looks so different for every person. Lots of different modalities will call to each of us. And the way that I've categorized it is from the easiest entry to the richest of experiences. So I kind of categorize it like a restaurant menu, right? There are appetizers, which are things that are more cerebral, podcasts, books, things along those lines, sound healing, things that are a very easy entrance. And then there are shared plates, which are modalities that you would experience with another practitioner. The entree section is really that deeper work. It's a lot of the somatic practices, core energetics, moving these things out of your body. They're the things that are probably going to bring up more of the emotion and more of that release. Extremely beneficial. And then the desserts, because you have to have dessert, are more the plant medicines and psychedelics. May not be for everyone, depending upon mental health conditions or medications that are being taken. But those are typically going to be the things that you engage with the least, and they are the richest of experiences. Again, not for everyone, and I'm not, making a recommendation for those. But again, I don't know what someone is going to be called to. So someone might be called to, again, working with the therapist to start, getting really interested in some of these other modalities that are available. And there are thousands of them, right? So this is a place where you can go to just explore and kind of search through, see what calls to you.
Beautiful. And what I loved in your book is, Kelly, how you explained your own experiences going through different modalities, especially the dessert section. You painted a really vivid story about your experience. And I've been hearing more and more about those stories, and it really resonated with me. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, so you're talking about ayahuasca, I think.
Yes. Yeah.
So I done ayahuasca for the first time after having never done a psychedelic in my life. I was 42 when I did it. I did it in the rainforest in the Amazon in Peru, and it was an incredibly impactful experience. In retrospect, I'm not sure that I would recommend anyone never do a psychedelic before and then go straight to ayahuasca, because it is a very rich, vivid, beautiful and painful kind of experience. And I don't mean physically, but very emotionally and psychologically. It's something to prepare for sure. But that's also something that called to me for years before I actually engaged with it. Since then, I've been microdosing psilocybin, which I know a lot of people are either doing or are curious about. So I'm always happy to talk about that. But again, all of these things are available. And I think in the dessert section on that website, myhealingmenu.com, there are easily 20, 25 different types of plant medicines, and they all have different kind of hallucinogenic effect to varying degrees. So yeah, it's just interesting. But again, that's going to be on a limited basis.
Exactly. And my own journey. So I've run Canada Career Counseling for 15 years now. And when I started out in the career counseling, career psychology journey, it was all about there's career, and then there's the personal stuff. And that's the stuff of therapists. And so, but what I learned very early on is it's the whole human being who's going through their career decisions, their career transitions, their workplace issues. So over time, I hired more and more therapists. And then we spun off synthesis psychology, which is a therapy practice. So we have that going as well, because people need healing. And you can't focus on the cerebral parts of your career development until you focus on yourself and your healing and your greater purpose and meaning, which is something that we do a lot of work in. But I've brought in EMDR, for example, which you talk about in the book, really like the mind and the body connection, more important than ever before. And there's a menu of therapies, and there's something for everyone, isn't there, Kelly?
Yeah. Yeah. And I also want to say that while we're talking about all of this, there is no one particular modality that is going to be the only thing that you need to engage with. It is going to be multiple things over the course of time, for the rest of your life. Once you step one foot on this path, it's like a whole menagerie of things that you will and will probably engage with in order to get what you need in order to integrate this trauma. And when I say integrate, I mean really we're not getting rid of it, right? We're not saying the trauma that I experienced is something I don't want to have anymore. You have it already. It's already in your body, right? It's already part of how your mental formations work and your personality and all of these things. It's part of your formative experience. So we're not trying to get rid of it. We're trying to learn from it, work with it, and integrate it into finding out that many of the things that have happened to us and how they've informed who we are, there are a lot of gifts that come with that, right? So for example, growing up in a really tumultuous environment with a mother with mental illness and physically abusive, I was hyper vigilant. I was tracking everything and everyone in every room I was ever in, which is a lot of labor, a lot of emotional labor. That has come online. I mean, that's still part of who I am, right? That's part of my imprint. That has come online in moments when I needed it to, when I was actually in an unsafe situation and needed to track what was going on in order to keep myself and other people safe. So I can recall those things and have those pieces of myself, those traits, those characteristics come online when I need to. But otherwise, I'm safe in my body, and my little kid knows that they are very safe on a day-to-day basis and don't need to be sitting in that hypervigilance and soup of cortisol and adrenaline all the time, right? So that's what I mean by integrating, right? So yeah, there's so much to this, and it really is a lifelong commitment, and it's beautiful work. Yes, it can be painful. I'm not here to sugarcoat that, but it's really beautiful work. And what's on, I won't call it the other side, but what's on the part of the process is a lot of joy and a lot of access to really positive emotions that you may not have had access to historically. So, yeah.
Well put. And thank you for your creative energy around the menu concept and all the analogies around food and appetizers. And I just love that. Thank you.
Right? Like, we all have to eat. We're all familiar with what a restaurant menu looks like, and it was the easiest way to talk about something really complex.
So we will share myhealingmenu.com in the show notes. And I know that in there you have podcasts, you have books. So I'm not even going to ask you because I think it's all in there, right? Your recommendations for different forms of learning and healing are all in myhealingmenu.com, right?
Yeah, and there will be other things that will be continuously added because, as you know, like, more things are coming online, all the time. And so, yeah, we'll keep that updated. There's nothing for sale on there. It's literally just an educational resource.
That's just so generous of you to keep that updated. And people should bookmark that because rest assured, you're going to experience more curveballs in life and you'll go through patches where you need to double down on your healing, and having a menu available to you to go back to. What a wonderful gift.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. The other nice thing about it is that there's an open comment section. So if, you have experienced one of these modalities and you want to share your experience, there's a way for you to share that story and help other people who may be curious about it or may be wondering, oh, is this for me? This might seem scary, or this might seem like really new. I'm uncertain about the experience. So you sharing and you being vulnerable enough to say, hey, I've experienced ketamine, or I went and did craniosacral therapy, or whatever the modality is. Sharing that experience will help other people. So there's a little bit of a community that I hope gets generated out of it too.
I really, really hope so too. And if you could have one wish for a better world when it comes to leaders out there, what would it be?
Work on your side of the street. Yeah. Take responsibility, to work on you. Because when you work on you, the not just energetic effect, right? The physical and palpable and measurable impact of that is on every person that you're going to encounter, employees, business partners, associates, as well as people in your family, your friends, your community. Like, the ripple impact of you working on you and you becoming a more rooted, grounded, centered person is exponential. So, yeah, take ownership for your side of the street.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kelly. I've learned so much from you. I love your book. We're going to promote it as much as we can because I think it's a book that should be in every leader's hands, basically. I think that the world needs more healed leaders, or healing. Healed is not an end destination, it's a lifelong process. And that's what I really gained from you. And thank you. I am just honored to have gotten to know you, and I hope we stay connected, Kelly.
Thank you so much for having me on. It was a pleasure.
Stay well, everyone. Thank you for tuning into this episode of Where Work Meets Life. If you found this content valuable, please rate and review the episode and share with others who may benefit. Visit me on my website at drlaura.live and sign up for my monthly e-newsletter full of tips and resources. I'm also a passionate keynote speaker and would be delighted to speak with you on your speaking needs. Stay well.